My father was a clockmaker, a man who understood the intricate heartbeat of brass gears and silver springs. He used to say that time was a river, steady and unidirectional. But in the autumn of 1912, when I traveled into the untracked wilderness of the Northern Territories to claim a remote timber parcel, I discovered that time can also be a swamp, stagnant, treacherous, and filled with things that have long since rotted. I found the valley by accident. My horse, a sturdy mare named Bess, refused to cross the ridgeline. She stood shivering, her eyes rolled back to the whites, staring into a depression in the earth where the mist sat as thick and yellow as sulfur. I left her tied to a birch tree and descended on foot, my heavy iron lantern the only thing anchoring me to reality. As I breached the fog line, the sound of the forest vanished. There was no wind, no bird song, only a rhythmic, metallic grinding that seemed to vibrate upward through the soles of my boots. The trees here were different. They weren't made of wood. Their trunks were encased in a layer of rusted copper, and their leaves with thin sheets of shimmering, jagged tin. I reached the center of the valley and found a village. It was perfectly preserved, a cluster of stone cottages arranged in a circle. But as I walked the main street, I realized something was horribly wrong. The people were there, but they were frozen in mid-motion. A woman stood by a well, her hand outstretched to catch a bucket that hung suspended in the air. A blacksmith held a hammer an inch above an anvil. They weren't statues. I could see the pulse in the woman's neck moving so slowly it took minutes for a single beat. I approached the woman. Her skin felt like cold parchment. I looked into her eyes and saw a terrifying depth of consciousness. She was aware, trapped in a second that lasted for years. I reached out to touch the water in the bucket, but it was as hard as diamond. That's when I noticed the sound again, the grinding. It was coming from a massive tower at the far end of the village, a structure made of interlocking gears that scraped against the sky. The tower was the heart of the valley. As I drew closer, the air began to feel thick, like walking through honey. Every step took immense effort. I looked at my own hands and saw they were beginning to turn a dull, metallic gray. My fingernails were hardening into brass. I panicked and tried to run back toward the ridge, but my movements were slowing. I was being pulled into the machinery of the valley. I sought shelter in the nearest cottage. Inside, a family sat around a dinner table, a father, a mother, and a young girl. They were all frozen, their forks halfway to their mouths. But the girl's eyes moved. They flickered toward me, filled with an ancient, agonizing plea. On the table in front of the father was a ledger. I opened it, the pages brittle and smelling of ozone. The last entry read, "The great spring has snapped. We are the oil now. We are the lubricant for the forever second." I heard a heavy, mechanical footstep outside. Not the rhythmic grinding of the tower, but something purposeful. I looked through the grime-streaked window and saw the Watchmaker. He was 10 feet tall, a spindly construct of brass rods and leather bellows. His head was a massive, four-faced clock, each face showing a different century. He carried a long, hooked pole used for winding the heavy weights. He stopped at the cottage door. The 4 clocks on his head began to chime, a dissonant, ear-shattering sound that made the windows crack. I hid beneath the heavy oak table, pressing myself against the frozen feet of the family. The door creaked open, and the smell of hot grease and scorched copper filled the room. The watchmaker wasn't looking for me. He was here to harvest the time. The creature reached for the father. With a brutal, mechanical efficiency, it opened the man's chest. There were no organs inside, only a complex arrangement of gears that had grown through his ribs. The watchmaker removed a central spring, glowing with a faint blue light, and placed it into a satchel. The father's body immediately crumbled into fine, gray ash. I realized then that everyone in this valley was being used to keep the great engine turning. The watchmaker moved with a terrifying, jerky precision. As he left the cottage with the father's essence, I knew I couldn't stay hidden. The air was becoming so dense that my own breathing sounded like a slow-motion bellows. I crawled out from under the table, leaving the mother and daughter to their frozen vigil, and followed the trail of thick, black oil the creature left in the dust. I needed to find the source of the distortion. I needed to break the mainspring of this nightmare. I reached the base of the great tower. Up close, the scale of it was impossible. Massive iron pistons, the size of steamships, hammered into the earth, and the sky above was choked with the black smoke of burning memories. The entrance was a jagged archway of interlocking teeth. I stepped inside, and the gravity shifted. I was no longer walking on stone, but on a vast, rotating platform of brass. Looking down, I saw the lubricant the ledger had mentioned. Thousands of people, their bodies fused together, were being crushed between the primary gears to keep the metal from seizing. I climbed a ladder of copper rungs that burned my hands with cold. My skin was now almost entirely brass, the joints of my fingers clicking with every movement. I reached the apex chamber, a room filled with the blinding blue light I had seen earlier. In the center sat the Chronos core, a sphere of pure, liquid time suspended in a cage of lightning. And standing before it was the Watchmaker, his four faces spinning so fast they became a blur of golden light. He turned to me, his movement fluid for the first time. "You are an anomaly," the voices of the four clocks spoke in unison, echoing like a cathedral bell. "A second that refused to be counted. You carry a rhythm of the world outside, a pulse that could reset the great coil." He raised his hooked pole, the tip glowing with an intense heat. He didn't want to kill me, he wanted to forge me into a key. I swung my iron lantern at the creature's central chest plate. The glass shattered and the kerosene ignited against his ancient leather bellows. The watchmaker let out a sound like 1,000 violins snapping at once. As he stumbled, I lunged for the Chronos core. I didn't have a weapon, so I used the only thing I had left, my own heart, which was still beating with the frantic, irregular rhythm of a living man. I pressed my chest against the shimmering blue sphere. The collision was like being hit by a freight train made of memories. I saw the birth of the stars and the death of the sun in the span of a heartbeat. The tower began to groan, the gears reversing their rotation with a deafening, metallic scream. The yellow fog was sucked into the core, and the village below began to accelerate. The woman at the well finished her movement, the bucket crashing into the water. The blacksmith's hammer struck the anvil. The frozen world was screaming back to life. The watchmaker dissolved into a shower of rusted springs and dry parchment. The last thing I felt was a sensation of falling, not through space, but through years. I woke up on the ridgeline, the sun blindingly bright. My horse, Bess, was gone, but the trees were wood again and the birds were singing. I looked at my hands. They were flesh, but beneath the skin of my wrist, I could see a faint, rhythmic ticking. I walked for 3 days until I reached the nearest town. It was no longer 1912. The people were wearing strange, thin fabrics, and horseless carriages moved silently through the streets. I had escaped the valley, but I had landed in a future that didn't know me. I live in a small room now, above a repair shop. I don't need a clock to tell the time. I can feel every second passing in my marrow. I am the only one who remembers the watchmaker and the village in the fog. But sometimes, when the city gets too quiet, I hear a rhythmic grinding beneath the pavement. I know the great spring hasn't been broken. It's just winding up again, waiting for a new valley to swallow. And every morning I check my reflection, fearing the day I see the first speck of brass in my eyes.